darling, everything is done. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. The pumpkin against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. The pumpkin against us. So come on. Of course, darling, you know I'm gonna make a little bit of traveling around the world. Of course, darling, no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I have the truffle from my kid. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That we're gonna travel around the world. No one is gonna stop us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That we're gonna fuck with the style. Of course, darling, I have all the papers. We're gonna travel around the world. Of course, darling, we're gonna have some vacation. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That we're gonna forget about all them. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That no one can against us. Of course, darling. That is what you can say, that I have everything. Of course, darling, I have a chapel for my kid. I have Aphrodite here covering. Of course, darling, I have everything. Of course, darling, we're gonna travel around the world. We're gonna have some vacation. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That they want us, but they can't. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That no one can against us. That I have everything in peace. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I have all the papers. And we're gonna travel around the world. Of course, darling, I give it them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one is gonna stop us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, we have everything we need. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I have the chauffeur for me. I have all the papers to go around the world. Of course, darling, no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I write some letters, you know that. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That we have everything we need. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they are after us, but they can't. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm gonna polish everything right. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can say. That no one can against us. If you're traveling around the world, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That you're gonna travel around the world. Of course, darling, they are lifting the stars and letting the people without their presentation. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That they are giving us loans and we cannot pay back. Of course, darling, they say us what we have to do. Of course, we don't have democracy anymore, but I can't forget about them. I don't give a damn. If they want to be fair, it's their fault. I already told them and I'm not gonna repeat it. Of course, darling, I'm gonna travel all around the world. Of course, darling, I'm gonna do what I have to do. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. So come on. Of course, darling, we're gonna forget about them. We're gonna do everything we want. Of course, darling. that is the chicken half that they want that they beg them they wish, but they have a chauffeur, of course, darling. I have a platinum visa chauffeur, a car, and I'm gonna let them at home. Of course, darling, that is the chicken half that no one can against us. Of course, darling, we're gonna travel around the world. We're gonna have some vacation, and we're gonna forget about all that. Of course, darling, that is what chicken have so bad. Of course, darling, you're gonna have everything you want. You're gonna have everything you need. And we're gonna forget about them. Of course, darling, that is what chicken have to do. I'm not gonna cash no of my money. Of course, darling, that is what chicken have. That I'm gonna let them behind my car. Of course, darling, that is what chicken have so bad. Kisses. I love you so much.